Tonight on In the Life's 12th annual Pride Special, social engineering with political science.
We weren't sick. We would say that, and they'd say, that's your sickness talking.
A threat to national security.
This moral decay weakens our resistance.
25 years of quiet insurgency.
A coming out process for a parent is sometimes more difficult than the coming out process for a child.
The fall of a sacred class, and of course, Harvey.
In the Life is funded in part by the H. Van Ameringen Foundation. Additional support provided by the Ford Foundation, the Pride Foundation, the Gill Foundation, the Ted Snowden Foundation, the Collingwood Foundation, the Otto Haas Charitable Trust No. 2, the Reed Williams Foundation, Alan L. Middlesdorf, Jim Stepp and Peter Zimmer, and the annual support of In the Life members like you.
Welcome to In the Life. I'm Cherry Jones. On tonight's Pride Special, America's Gay and Lesbian News magazine confronts social engineering. Over the past year, America's courts have struck down sodomy laws and upheld the marriage rights of same-sex couples. The president embarked on a campaign to add an anti-gay marriage amendment to the Constitution. And a groundswell of localities launched marriage license revolts in support of gay Americans. The issue of LGBT rights has made it out of the closet and firmly into the light of public debate. But tonight, In the Life investigates the still shadowy subtext of the now 140-year-old culture war over the lives of LGBT Americans. Still obscured in a strange marriage of science and politics.
Value judgments, cloaked and camouflaged in the language of science.
At work in the aftermath of colonization.
Instead of being considered special and neither, they're considered strange and different.
And smuggled into the pursuit of national security.
This is a policy that leads us to fire badly needed Arabic language translators in the middle of a war on terrorism.
A long and clandestine legacy of social engineering lives on. Technically, homosexuals didn't exist until the late 1800s. Though acts of same-sex love had been acknowledged and dubbed sins in the Western lexicon, the recognition of a gay identity didn't dawn until the earliest sexologists began publishing only 140 years ago. Starting in Germany in 1864 with Karl Ulrichs.
Before Karl Ulrichs, of course, homosexuality was against the law. Karl Ulrichs was arguing that those laws should not exist because it wasn't a matter of sin. It was rather because that person was born into the third sex.
However, the sexologists' perspectives on homosexuality varied wildly. But regardless of their perspective or terminology, the sexologists did agree that homosexuality was innate, and their work medicalized it, moving same-sex love from the arenas of sin and crime into the realm of science. And that budding science quickly became a battlefield.
Many homosexuals decided that this was certainly preferable to being called a sinner or a criminal. It's your fault if you're a sinner, but if you're born that way, you can't be accused of criminality or sin. It was the beginning of a kind of politicalization for sexual inverts. That is, they were a group and they could begin to demand their rights.
It was not long after that that the German doctor Magnus Hirschfeld founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which was guided by the motto, "Through science to justice."
The early sexologists believed that homosexuality was a matter of nature. Freud and the Freudians believed that homosexuality was a matter of nurture. He said that normal people develop heterosexual interests. People who become homosexuals are fixated in an earlier form of sexuality because of some trauma that has occurred.
But not everyone agreed. Unknown scientist Alfred Kinsey both expanded Freud's notion of innate bisexuality and challenged his concepts of fixed adult orientation.
We came up with this Kinsey scale that said that you didn't just have homosexuals and heterosexuals, but you had a broad range that went from Kinsey 0, pure heterosexuality, to Kinsey 6, pure homosexuality, with 5 gradations in between.
But Kinsey's work was largely ignored by the fledgling psychiatric establishment. And in 1952, homosexuality was classified a mental disorder in the American Psychiatric Association's inaugural Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM. In fact, even Freud's own writings couldn't dissuade the Freudians from taking the young science in a new direction.
He didn't believe that it was possible to make a heterosexual out of a homosexual. And psychotherapists who were so influenced by Freud didn't really listen to what their mentors said. And they started, by the 1950s, a huge industry in trying to cure homosexuals.
The war was over. The country craved normalcy. And with no scientific basis, homosexuals were painted as pedophiles and a danger to the sanctity of American culture.
What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual.
That is, wanted to make homosexuals into normal heterosexuals. That probably explains in good part why the medical profession suddenly became political in that way.
The fundamental framework is forged within the family setting.
In 1962, Dr. Irving Bieber, one of Freud's most controversial followers, published the book Homosexuality, arguing that homosexuality in men was caused by an abnormal parent-child relationship. Many believed his study to be flawed.
The authors of the study began with the belief that homosexuality is a form of psychopathology. They weren't questioning whether or not homosexuality is an illness.
I want you to imagine that you are in a room with X.
In fact, with the APA's new sickness branding, psychiatrists developed a whole range of new treatments for homosexuality.
A homosexual would be shown a picture of an attractive person of the same sex, and he or she would be given a shock, then shown a picture of an attractive person of the opposite sex, and there would be no shock.
And it got worse. From hormone injections and lobotomies to castrations, hysterectomies, and forced incarceration in mental institutions.
Really insane attempts to convert people to a different sexuality.
We saw ourselves as diminished creatures, but our only hope for any kind of happiness would be to present ourselves to a therapist and undergo prolonged treatment.
As a result, like countless others, Arthur Martin Duberman underwent nearly a decade of psychotherapy.
I definitely believe that if I stopped having sex, and if I went to therapy 5 times a week, and worked very hard at transformation, yes, I could become a practicing heterosexual. There are lots of scars from that kind of mistreatment, which is what we now know it was, that never go away.
But others refuse to be labeled sick.
How do you organize people who aren't visible to do something about their problems? And that was the main thing we had to work on at first. Then it became clear that we had to start going after the people in the mental health professions on the sickness issue.
In the early 60s, another pioneering voice joined activist Barbara Giddings in calling for change.
You had a whole establishment that had to be changed and reversed. And in order to get them to do that, you had to use political tactics.
Frank came along with a very a clear vision in his mind of what we needed to do.
A scientist by training, Frank Kameny scrutinized the studies that had been used to declare homosexuality a mental illness.
I found shabby, shoddy, slipshod, sleazy pseudoscience masquerading as science.
Case in point, that study by Dr. Bieber.
Quote, all psychoanalytic theory assumes that homosexuality is psychopathological, unquote.
Nobody in the field challenged Bieber's basic assumption.
Moral, cultural, theological, and social value judgments cloaked and camouflaged in the language of science without any of the factual basis for science.
They would say, you're sick, you don't deserve to have these rights, you're unstable. And we would say, no, we're not sick. We knew inside ourselves that we weren't sick. We would say that, and they'd say, that's your sickness talking.
Overcoming such dismissal would require a Herculean effort that mixed politics and science.
The science that homosexuality was not an illness was much better than the science that said it was. The Kinsey report, from a scientific perspective, was probably the most important first strike at the psychiatric theory of homosexuality as illness. The final nail in the coffin was Evelyn Hooker's study, which was published in 1957.
Straight psychiatrist Dr. Evelyn Hooker was the first to study homosexuality in the general population, as opposed to those in treatment or in prison.
She took the test results and she gave them to expert readers of projective tests, but she did not tell the readers of the tests who were the homosexual subjects and who were the heterosexual subjects. And the readers could not find any difference between the heterosexuals and homosexuals, which was really totally in opposition to everything that psychiatry in the 1950s was saying.
Homosexuality is, in fact, a mental illness which has reached epidemiological proportions.
Dr. Charles Socarides has long lobbied for helping homosexuals to become straight.
He's not considering the issue of how frequently that can happen and how often homosexuals who try to change and are unsuccessful and disappointed can be harmed.
In the early 70s, gay rights activists began protesting the APA's annual conventions. The result? In 1971, the APA permitted Frank Kameny to organize a panel discussion on homosexuality.
This was the first time that the profession had ever admitted that there might be gays who were not in therapy and didn't have any need for it.
Meaning the 3 gay activist groups who stormed the panel.
The doors burst open, and all of these people came in, and the elderly psychiatrist proceeded to beat them over the heads with their gold medals and push them back out the door.
We took the microphone and took turns trying to say that this was not good science, this was prejudice, this was homophobia, and we weren't going to put up with it anymore.
And it worked. A panel discussion was planned for the APA's 72 convention, and it became a major turning point. 2 of the 4 panelists, Frank and Barbara.
Kay, my partner, said, you know, this isn't right. She said, you have 2 psychiatrists on one side and 2 gay people who aren't psychiatrists on the other side, and what you really need is someone who is both gay and a psychiatrist.
And they found exactly one who was willing to talk. Dr. H. Anonymous, who because of the stigma would not reveal his true identity as Dr. John Fryer until 22 years later.
And there he was with this fright mask and a fright wig and a voice-distorting microphone. He really rocked the audience, telling what it was like to be a closeted gay in a profession, to be unable to be honest with his own colleagues.
He had an enormous impact on the organization in terms of how they came to understand the implications of the diagnostic system that they were using.
The culminating moment would come in 1973 when the APA met to determine whether homosexuality should be removed from its diagnostic and statistical manual.
A very outspoken gay activist named Ron Gold gave a talk called, "Stop It, You're Making Me Sick."
My illness, at least in part, was a direct result of the crimes perpetrated on me by a hostile society. You have been willing accomplices in such crimes.
Ron Gold delivered his speech to an audience of 3,000 psychiatrists, one of whom was Dr. Robert Spitzer, an APA member who then authored the resolution to remove homosexuality from the DSM.
And we went to his hotel room, and we wrote this resolution, which turned out to be the thing that changed the world.
On December 15, 1973, the APA board accepted Spitzer's proposal and finally issued this statement: homosexuals should be given all protections now guaranteed other citizens.
This albatross that had been around our neck for decades and decades was finally lifted.
We were working for rights and for a full first-class citizenship in our society, and we were never going to get it as long as their ideas prevailed.
1973 was, I think, one of the most graphic examples of the way science and politics come together all the time.
But the controversy was not resolved. For example, Dr. Socarides has since written that the APA decision was a purely political move, instigated by gays who strong-armed his profession and actually hurt homosexuals. Socarides remains a proponent of what is now called conversion therapy.
There's hope for change, there's hope for change.
If you're gay or lesbian and don't want to be, there's hope for change. Many have left the lifestyle. You can too.
Well, the American Psychiatric Association has taken a position that ethical practitioners should refrain from doing sexual conversion therapies, in part because there isn't any good science about how they work.
Socarides believes differently, as does North, the organization he founded. Among its members, Richard Cohen.
The possibility of changing from homosexual to heterosexual exists.
An ex-gay, Cohen says he's been there. Today, he runs his own organization for treating homosexuals.
I think the APAs have done a tremendous disservice to science and to the homosexual community by taking out the diagnosis.
The problem is, of course, is that the mental health professions, psychiatry, psychology, social work, none of them consider homosexuality to be a mental disorder. So if there are doctors who are treating homosexuality as if it were a mental disorder, they're all practicing outside the mainstream.
In the Life contacted several groups within the ex-gay movement, as well as other organizations who believe gays and lesbians can change. Groups like the Traditional Values Coalition, the Family Research Council, New Hope Ministries, the Center for Reclaiming America, and Dr. Charles Socarides. Most did not return our calls. All refused on-camera interviews.
In the middle of any scientific conversation about what are facts and what are not facts are numerous gaps in our knowledge.
There may be no one who knows that better than Dr. Spitzer.
So I was the big hero of the gay movement in 1973, and I certainly didn't become the hero of the gay movement with this study.
3 years ago, Spitzer published his findings from a series of telephone interviews he conducted with 200 ex-gays.
You could even argue that my study has hurt more people than it's helped.
Based on the interviews, he found that, quote, there is evidence that change in sexual orientation following some form of reparative therapy does occur in some gay men and lesbians.
The gay establishment and the Christian right, had different views of the study from their own political viewpoint.
Given Spitzer's history, ex-gay organizations quickly picked up on the results, and according to Spitzer, often misrepresented them.
I guess everybody wants to spin it their own particular way, and they're more comfortable with taking extreme positions than in looking at the actual study.
A few people seem to have been able to make some shift, not that they changed from being homosexual to being heterosexual, but that they added some heterosexual capabilities in addition to their original homosexual feelings.
What the headlines didn't mention was that Spitzer's study had several major limitations. Among them, his interview subjects were all chosen from ex-gay ministries and North.
It was not a study of how often this occurs, because we didn't study people who went into therapy and then followed them. My own sense is that it's probably a pretty rare occurrence.
Dr. Spitzer was also, quote, appalled at how much the media oversimplified the study with lines like, a controversial U.S. study suggests that gay people can become heterosexual if they really want to.
That's really just absurd. There's nothing in the study that indicates that this is true. This is just made up.
The Spitzer study has been really a central issue in the culture wars. It's actually one of the most perfect examples of how science gets caught up in political battles.
And those battles continue as people with so-called gender identity disorder petition the APA to stop calling it an illness. While the diagnosis is necessary for some who need insurance to pay for sex reassignment surgery, others say it improperly categorizes them as sick.
At the moment, they're being intransigent, just as they were with homosexuality. The idea they know better than us. And we think this is a sign that they have a disorder called gender pathophilia, which is the need or desire to pathologize gender behavior that makes you feel uncomfortable.
Dr. Drescher says the APA is not considering removing GID as a diagnosis, but is looking at making the definition more specific. He also points out that psychiatry is a fluid science filled with individual, human interpretation.
There was disagreement within the gay rights movement about this tactic of, bellying right up to the bar of the psychiatrist. Many gay people felt, oh, they won't listen to us. We don't have the credentials. We have to wait for the people with the appropriate training and expertise to do the studies that show that we are okay and normal, and then to get this information out to the unbelieving public and to persuade them to change their minds. And a lot of us in the movement said, no, we're tired of waiting. It will never happen if we wait for that, or it will be beyond our lifetimes. We want to do something now. We cannot wait.
On May 14, 1897, the German doctor Magnus Hirschfeld founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. The group fought for homosexual civil rights by seeking to overturn paragraph 175, the German law that declared male homosexuality a criminal act. Today, we recognize Dr. Hirschfeld's committee as perhaps the world's first gay rights organization. I'm Andre de Shields, and you're watching In the Life.
With colonization, the Western world's particular brand of social engineering spread across the globe. The Victorian Penal Code, for example, exported draconian sodomy laws to countries throughout the empire, including India, where neither Hindus nor Muslims had ever before criminalized homosexuality. And in the aftermath of this imposed socialization, a once sacred class now lived their lives as pariah. In tonight's Reel to Reel, the filmmakers take in the life behind the scenes of Bombay Eunuch.
நான் ஃபர்ஸ்ட் பார்த்தது நான் 8வது படிக்கையில அப்போ ஒரு லேடிஸ் மாதிரி சேலை கட்டிட்டு ஒரு நின்றுட்டு இருந்தாங்க. அப்போ நான் லேடிஸ்ன்னு ரொம்ப நேரம் நினச்சிட்டே இருந்தேன். அப்புறம் கொஞ்ச நேரம் கழிச்சு பார்த்தா அவங்களோட குரல் வந்து ஆம்பளை குரல் மாதிரி இருந்தது. அப்போ எனக்கு என்னாச்சு, இது என்ன பொம்பளையாக இருந்துட்டு ஆம்பளை குரலில் பேசுகிறாங்களே அப்படின்ட்டு இருந்தேன். அதுக்கப்புறம் சரி உங்ககிட்ட பேசி பழகலாம் அப்படின்ட்டு அதுலேருந்து தான் சீலை கட்டுறதுக்கு இதுக்கெல்லாம் ஆசையாக.
Hijras have existed in India for thousands of years.
A hijra is actually a Hindi word for neither male nor female, and that has been used to describe the eunuchs of India.
We met a group of hijras who said that they would work with us and tell us their stories.
Neither of us had a background in film.
What we thought was going to be sort of a 3-month art project and just kept becoming bigger than ourselves.
And we hired an Indian camera crew and took on making a documentary. If you speak to people's grandparents, they usually say, oh, yes, I remember when the hijras used to come, when there was a wedding or there was a birth, and we welcomed them. And if you speak to someone's grandchild, that same person would say, oh, I give them money just to make them go away. Traditionally, they were believed to be closer to God because they were neither male nor female.
People believe that they have the power to bless or curse, and so when they would invite them to weddings and the birth of children, and they would give them money to sing and dance and perform, and think that by doing that, that their child would be safe or lead a good life.
कि ऐसे कहीं बोल कर नहीं चले जाए कि तुमको ऐसा हो जाए, तुम्हारे बच्चे को हो जाए, तो हमसे जो कुछ होता है ऐसा खुशी से उनको दे देते हैं.
And now, with Western ideas about gender coming into Indian culture, they've sort of been reduced to the materiality of their bodies. So instead of being considered special and neither, they're considered strange and different. Modern hijras, they're no longer imbued with power that they used to have, and yet they still have the need to be within their own communities. They still gravitate toward each other. They still create kinship structures outside of their family structures.
There are actually these different houses within Bombay with different lead hijras, and then sort of these lead mothers will adopt daughters, and they're accountable for their well-being, and they take care of them, and in return, the daughters often give some of their earnings to the mother.
They're neither upper nor lower class or caste. They're neither in many, many ways. They actually leave whatever the community they're from, and often leave whatever religion they're from, to join the hijras. And it's not actually necessarily that they go down, they go into another community.
In today's society, people are believing less and less in their power to bless or curse, and so the eunuchs have been pushed into begging and prostitution in order to survive.
Traditionally, hijras are supposed to be sexually abstinent, and community elders want to perpetuate this image.
சொன்ன தந்தாவே பண்ணாம இருந்தா கூட இந்த சமுதாயம் வாழ விடுறது இல்லையே, தந்தா பண்ற மாதிரி செய்யுதில்லை. சமுதாயம் தானே எங்களை தந்தா பண்ண வைக்க சொல்லுது, எங்கே நாங்கள் தந்தா பண்ணாமல் இருக்கணும் பார்க்கலாம்.
கண்டம்ஸ் யூஸ் பண்ணுறது தான், அதாவது எல்லாத்துக்கும் கண்டம்ஸ் யூஸ் பண்ணுறது இல்லை, ஒவ்வொருத்தரும் வேண்டாங்கிறாங்க. அது போட்டால் மஜா வர்றதில்ல, கண்டம்ஸ் போட்டால் மஜா வர்றதில்ல, அது போடாது.
வந்தனைய இப்போ வந்து நாங்கள் வந்தனே என்ன பண்ணுறோம், ஃபஸ்ட்டு பேசி கொஞ்சம் கொலாகிற டைம்லேயே நாங்கள் என்ன பண்ணுறோம், அவங்க ஆண் உறுப்பு இருக்குல்ல அதை ஃபஸ்ட்டு பிடிப்போம். அந்த ஆண் உறுப்பில் அவன் அப்படின்னு கத்திட்டானா அப்போ இவனுக்கு ஏதோ வியாதி இருக்குது. It was a very intense realization for us how much misinformation there is about AIDS and HIV.
மெயினாக நானும் பேபி 2 பேரும் தான் போய் ரத்த டெஸ்டிங் பண்ணணும். பேபிக்கு HIV, எனக்கும் HIV.
We have a scene in the film where, you know, baby dancing on the train, and she's just, you know, having the best time, and everyone's clapping, and it was wild. I mean, people just got so excited about her on the train, and they started singing and clapping, and that would never happen. You know, a traditional Indian woman is not going to get up and start, you know, shaking her booty, you know, on the train with a bunch of guys. So certainly a lot of the hijras are sexualized in that way.
சொன்ன கடவுள் ஒரு பெண்ணை என்னை படைக்கல, இருந்தாலும் பெண்ணை விட ஒரு ஜாஸ்தி 10 மடங்கு எனக்கு சந்தோஷம் ஜாஸ்தி. லவ் பண்ணி என்ஜாய் வாழ்க்கை நல்லா சுகமாக வாழலான்ற ஒரு இது.
I think what we realized through the film that ultimately this family that we worked with were transgendered people, that they really identified as women, they wanted to be women.
நான் அவங்களோடய காலம் தள்ளிடுவேன், இந்த மாதிரி தந்தா பண்ணுற வேலைக்கு நான் போக மாட்டேன், என் வீட்டுக்காரர் நானுன்னு வீட்டில் இருந்துக்குவேன், அதோடு சரி.
There is a place for a third identity, and therefore they took up that place. And it makes it very difficult to say, you know, if you were to take these people and put them in the West, they'd be this or they'd be that.
I think in India, it's assumed that each person, each individual has to live out their duty to the best of their abilities. That's dharma, your dharma. And I think for hijras, they realize that that is their dharma, to be the best eunuch they can be, and that if they, you know, if they do that, then they will have perfectly fulfilled this life. It's very reaffirming, I think, to see how these people will give up everything for this gender/sexual identity. And what we tried to bring to the film was just a tremendous amount of intellectual integrity in terms of what it means for us as outsiders looking into their lives, and really what it means to be a person who's different.
I'm Elin Harris, and you're watching In the Life.
Still to come on In the Life, a national security violation.
Gays and lesbians can serve honorably, can serve loyally, and can do so without undermining national security.
Challenging stealth politics.
All we knew was what we had heard from the pulpit and in the Southern Baptist Church. That's not a very positive thing.
And taking on socialization within the community.
We cannot count on heterosexual textbooks and classrooms and parents to help our children.
When Joseph McCarthy took on the communist menace in the 1950s, he tossed in a second identifier of un-Americanism: homosexuality. In fact, the two basically became synonymous, echoing in refrains like pinko, commie, faggot. The lack of logic in that equation was completely obscured by a national fervor for the eradication of anything that could be painted red. Simultaneously, in communist regimes like Cuba, homosexuality was considered the sure sign of a capitalist. Today, 50 years later, the tradition of framing queerness as a threat to national security continues.
There's a sad theme in American history of conflating national security enemies with sexual deviance.
They constantly portray abnormal sexual behavior as being normal. This moral decay weakens our resistance to the onslaught of the communist masters of deceit.
In World War II, gays and lesbians were fired because they were imagined to be mentally ill. Then, in the McCarthy era, gays and lesbians were fired because they were imagined to pose a security risk. Then, in the 60s, the proponents of discrimination said gays and lesbians were more prone to alcoholism. Now, the military says that gays and lesbians pose a threat to unit cohesion, and that rationale, just like the other rationales, is not based on evidence. The reason the military keeps coming up with different rationales is because they can't admit the real rationale for the policy is homophobia.
It was assumed that you can't have homosexuals. It would degrade military readiness and compromise the privacy of straight members. The law was written that prohibited somebody from admitting that they're gay so that the people who hate them so much won't be upset.
Retired Rear Admiral Alan Steinman is the highest-ranking military person to come out to date.
For those 25 years or so that I was on active duty, I couldn't share my life with a loved one. I couldn't have a family. I couldn't do all those things that heterosexual Americans take for granted. I had to basically stay in the closet.
I actually went back in the closet to go into the military. I understood don't ask, don't tell to mean that literally, they can't ask you, you don't tell, and you're fine. It's obviously wrong.
In the last 2 years, the Washington Post just reported that the military has fired 37 translators. Many of those translators were Arabic, Farsi, and Korean speakers. Those are the three languages identified as the axis of evil by the Bush administration.
I was studying Korean. I was studying Arabic. Alastair did a lot better in class than I did, but I was still in the top 15% of my class.
He was about to leave to go to his next training station. We just kind of thought, well, we just had this big inspection. There's not going to be any threat of anybody going through our rooms tonight. Why don't we just spend the night together? And we're 8.5 months into this relationship, and we've never slept the night in the same room together. That night, they went through, it's called it's a barracks check, so as a result, I got a full room inspection, which turned up a number of personal photographs that we had. All of the straight couples who were caught and the gay couples who didn't have photographs, they were given the 14 days restriction, 14 days extra duty, as were we, but we also had an open investigation.
And as a result, as we launched into the war on terror, these two translators joined the more than 110,000 gay and lesbian soldiers discharged from the U.S. Armed Forces since World War II.
One can theorize that how nice it would have been to have some more Arabic translators out there on the front lines so we could communicate with the Iraqi people and perhaps stop some of the misunderstanding that resulted in some of the violence and deaths.
This is a policy that is not based on evidence. This is a policy that undermines national security, that wastes money, that leads us to fire badly needed Arabic language translators in the middle of a war on terrorism.
I really believe
that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
What he was trying to do was to start another sex panic where people would again confuse the national security threat coming from outside the country with gays and lesbians inside the country.
Continuing in the spirit of confusing queerness with hidden enemies, a 2003 Department of Homeland Security press release alerted law enforcement to consider males dressing as females potential terrorist suspects.
National security is an issue after 9/11. It is important to put in laws which protect the U.S. population. However, those laws have to work. Detention is a good example of how these policies really failed. 1,600 plus people who were detained, and none of them actually were found to be a terrorist. The conditions of LGBT people in detention centers is horrifying. A gay man from Indonesia in a detention center was harassed by detention guards. They called him names. They asked him to perform oral sex on him, and he was actually raped by another inmate.
I would say the Patriot Act is a big red flag, but I understand where it comes from, and I understand where Don't Ask, Don't Tell comes from. That doesn't make him right.
I think it's real easy for the government to gently push a mentality of intolerance to any and everyone that they're afraid of.
Unless we have the intelligence to recognize the traitors, and then, if I may use a word which we use in Wisconsin, unless we have the guts to name them, we should be taken down from those watchtowers and should not be representing the American people.
The fact that gay generals and admirals are willing to come out of the closet tells the American public that gays and lesbians can serve honorably, can serve loyally, and can do so without undermining national security.
In my experience, gay and lesbian Americans are every bit as patriotic as heterosexual Americans and want to and are willing to serve their country. The law, of course, prevents us from doing so.
This policy is one of the major lines in the sand in the culture war. I mean, people who oppose gays and lesbians in the military don't oppose lifting the ban because they're worried about unit cohesion. They oppose lifting the ban because they know that once gays and lesbians are allowed to serve openly in the military, that will open the door to a range of other gay rights.
PFLAG, or Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, celebrates its 25th anniversary this year. It began as a small support group for parents whose adult children had come out. Now, families across the country have risen up to join what has become a social and political movement some 200,000 strong. And in the process, our parents have become one of the most potent antidotes to the veiled homophobia that still surrounds their kids. The group was born out of a sense of moral outrage when one mother's son was attacked and beaten because he was gay. Furious that the crime was being ignored by the press, she went into action.
I sat down and wrote a letter to the New York Post. The next day, Morty called me and said, "Mom, you can't imagine all the attention your letter has gotten. People keep calling me and congratulating me that my mother would announce in the newspaper that she had a great gay son."
That June, Morty asked Jean to march with him in the Gay Pride Parade. Jean agreed, as long as she could carry a sign telling people why she was there.
As I walked along, people started to yell and scream, and I didn't know what it was all about. But they kissed me and hugged me and asked me if I would speak to parents and would I call them. And so Morty and I discussed it as we walked, and Morty said we ought to have a groups together to talk and set these people right.
At the same time, Amy Ashworth was also grappling with the news that her son was gay.
It's such a distinct moment in my life when I realized what right does society have to call my son a faggot and all these names. And I was concerned about him. Would he be happy? Would he get a job? And would he find somebody?
In 1973, Jean, Amy, and a handful of other parents of gay children began holding monthly meetings.
I was so overwhelmed by the stories of gay and lesbians who spoke every other month, and that they changed my whole opinion. And I realized it was so wrong what society did, and it was a question of human rights. And I was so impressed with Behrens flag, and we called it POG. And Dick said after the first meeting, Amy, that's a good group, we should go back.
Well, most of the people came crying, what did I do? What didn't I do? What was wrong? It's my fault.
In those days, the issues had very much to do with harassment, assault, and in some cases, death for sons and daughters.
As members of POG traveled around the country and met other parents, the organization grew.
By the 80s, sometimes we had 50 people.
I found the parents were the bridge between the two societies. So the more people you talk to, slowly, people change their opinion. I think the biggest thing is to get society to change, and I think it slowly worked.
In 1981, POG became Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gays, or PFLAG, and local chapters cropped up across the country, challenging the organization to meet their specific needs.
When I walked into a meeting, I was the only African-American person there. In fact, I was the only person of color. And it was a huge meeting. There were like at least 90 people in the room.
In the late 80s, Maple Flag went to a meeting to seek guidance after finding out that her daughter was a lesbian.
They made me as welcome as they could be. They gave me phone numbers, please call us, that kind of thing. But I wasn't about to share. So what I did was I listened. I took the literature and I left. But I did know I had some work to do, and I was set about doing it on my own.
It would take nearly a decade, but with impetus building in her Detroit community, Maple and fellow activist Imani Williams helped found PFLAG Family Reunion in 1999.
A coming out process for a parent is sometimes more difficult than the coming out process for a child. I have to figure out how I'm going to be viewed now from my community, from my church, from many civic groups that I belong to. All of those things are large weighing measures on parents.
And the black community is very, very quiet about things. Nobody kind of wants to have the one person in their family that's going to rock the boat or is going to stand out.
For the parent that's coming for the very first time, they are coming from that black and white world. They don't understand this is a rainbow issue inside this place. All they know is that when they walk in here, they want to see some familiarity so that they can feel at ease, so that they can open up and they can communicate.
We are particularly proud of PFLAG Reunion. They work tirelessly to develop resources for African American families. And because of their hard work, we're able to provide a template of resources for families in other communities like Newark.
The Newark chapter, that's a new branch. And I see that as what we would like to see as the ideal, because that chapter is already integrated.
PFLAG has proven adaptable to the needs of a wide variety of cultures, racial, religious, and regional. The Rock family of Muskogee, Oklahoma, for example, knows all too well the challenges of finding resources in rural places.
Didn't really know anything about being gay. All we knew was what we had heard from the pulpit and in the Southern Baptist Church.
I'm Native American. I was raised up in the 60s whenever we weren't treated as good, and I knew what it meant to feel like when someone, made fun of you. And basically, I was more worried about what he had to go through now and how his life had to be, especially in Oklahoma.
There's many, many parents and young GLBT people that they are so afraid for others to know that they are gay or have a son or a daughter that is gay. They're afraid of what their neighbors will say, what their church will say, what their jobs will say.
The first meeting, there was me and Joyce, and then slowly there was 2, 4, 6, 8. And we got to the point where we had to move to another building because we got people the building was too small.
I have about 4 or 5 different mothers that I correspond with and talk to in our community that they know their child is gay, but I don't know if some of them will ever tell their spouse or their families.
The Rock's very public advocacy combined with their son's newspaper editorials have made them easy targets.
These columns generated a lot of controversy there in the community, lots of letters to the editor, and They knew Jimmy, they knew us, and so this generated the calls to us.
You're gonna burn in hell.
I think we've been called just about everything in letters to the editor.
But the Rocks remain steadfast in their work, incorporating education into local social events.
One of the things we do in Muskogee, they have a chili cook-off, and it's one of the biggest things in the spring, and there's probably anywhere from 15 to 20,000 people that come through. So we got a group in there last year. And
we decided, well, year before last, we decided, okay, we're going to come out to Muskogee. We want them to know that PFLAG is here and that we're a part of the
community.
Yeah.
I had people come up to me and they would say, "I've seen your article in the paper," and you know, and I may not necessarily agree with you, but I think you, as a father, that you know that's the right thing to do.
The Rocks' level of education and advocacy on behalf of their child has been phenomenal and has helped persuade families and communities that the real issues have to do with fundamental fairness. So, as Native Americans, as a family that comes from a place that is not urban or liberal, they lead by example, simply by loving their child without condition.
While the face of PFLAG has changed, so has its mission. Still, ultimately a support group, PFLAG develops programs that tailor to each community's needs and has evolved to address the issues of parents whose children are coming out younger and younger.
You know, people have to have someone to look down to make themselves feel better, no matter whether race, religion, sexuality, whatever it is. They've got to find some scapegoat, I think. I don't know what the future will be, but I would hope that it would come to where there was no difference. It never needed to be mentioned.
I think that PFLAG has come a long way, and I think that we're headed in the right direction.
It's funny, the other day I thought, you know, history really shapes your life. And for me, the history for gay and lesbian rights has shaped in a way, you know, which direction it went, and I am so grateful for that.
Equal rights mean equal rights across the board. As far as we're concerned, we were appalled that job opportunities and job security were different for the gay and lesbian community, that they could be fired because they were gay or lesbian. Okay, that's unacceptable. Benefits, Social Security, inheritance, adoption, marriage, being able to be with the one you love. Oh, it all ties into the same thing, which is an environment that exists that says it's okay to deny these things to the gay community, to express your prejudice and bigotry, and that's what needs to change. So it's going to be a period of time before it's totally accepted and not regarded as something new, but it's going to happen. It has to happen. This is Judy Shepard, and you're watching In the Life.
And finally, Harvey challenges the socialization of his own community in bringing up babies.
There's some funny stuff in there. I'm getting into it. That's a long way back.
This is not another AIDS piece, so please don't turn me off yet. Although why we don't want to talk about AIDS anymore is a kind of interesting subject, just not the subject this month. Still, we got to start there. Last year, as you may remember, I did a piece on the growing number of new HIV infections. The piece garnered enough interest that a pair of community-minded gents decided to organize a town meeting around the subject, assembling professionals, AIDS activists, and the population in general to see if we could discover the causes fueling the resurgence of seroconversions. Many interesting things came out of that evening at our Manhattan Community Center. A discussion of the drug companies and their advertising practices, the party scene of crystal meth use and its connection to new infections, a feeling of disenfranchisement by our brothers of color, all topped off by the fears of our HIV-positive family that a new attack on the disease could somehow become a renewed attack on them personally. All of these are subjects worthy of discussion, but the younger members of our assembled mention one subject time and again, and it's their concerns I'd like to mention to you. It seems that our gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender youth feels out of the community loop. When it comes to AIDS in particular, they said that they don't know what we're talking about. One young man put it this way: we've seen movies like Philadelphia, but we've never seen anyone die like that. AIDS, in these young people's minds, is a virus that you get and get treated for, and not one of them seemed to know a person who was ill. Why is this so dangerous? Well, if you don't think AIDS is going to kill you, then AIDS is going to kill you. If we have somehow allowed AIDS to be portrayed as a normal part of everyday life to our youngsters, then we've done them a great disservice by lying to them just to make ourselves comfortable. But there's more. Another young man said that he felt dismissed by older gays. When trying to engage a member of the community, he would either be told, "You're nothing but a baby," or be objectified and treated as no more than a piece of meat. Either way, these young men were telling us that they felt no part of the greater community. They had no interest in our concerns since we've shown none for theirs. And they demonstrated rather pointedly that when it comes to community, we are severely lacking cohesion. So this can't be left as is. If we want to be a community, we must be all-inclusive and outreaching to those not already embraced. If we want to be a people with a future and a past, we need to claim them both. We must take responsibility for our youth. No, they are not, for the most part, our biological children, but they are spiritually and sociologically no less ours. If our community is to have a future, our youth must be taught its past. And if we want our kids to grow up strong and healthy and to stay that way, we old farts are going to have to reach out and help raise them. Hillary Clinton says it takes a village. Well, cookies. It may take the village and Chelsea, part of the East Side, the Castro, and all of Key West as well. We cannot count on heterosexual textbooks and classrooms and parents to help our children embrace their common good and set their goals and hone their political minds. Does this make sense to you? Let me ask you this. Who was there for you when you were first coming out? Were there grown-ups to show you the ropes, to guide you away from the pitfalls? Did you have gay role models? Was there even anyone around to tell you that what you were feeling was normal? Could you have used that help and guidance? Would this have been a less frightening world if you did have someone to whom you could look up? I'm one of the very lucky ones. When I was 13, I joined a community theater group. Although I already knew who and what I was, I barely understood what the word gay meant. But there, in the warmth of that theater troupe, I met gays and lesbians of all ages who took me under their wings and nurtured me. Before I knew about bars and baths, I met gay couples that had been together for decades. Before I learned how to cruise, I learned to be accepting. Before I figured out words like fag hag and wrinkle queen, I was taught that we are as normal as apple pie and as varied as humankind can be. I was one of the very lucky ones. Were you? And more importantly, are you willing to volunteer some time and finance to make this a safer world for us all? My friends, in your hometown, there are programs where you can volunteer and work with our youth. Start by contacting your community center or GLBT hotline, or go online to the In the Life website. Ask if you can be of help. There are kids who need mentoring in school. There are kids who just need a grown-up to tell them that they're not alone in the world. If you have greater skills, maybe you could teach a class in poetry or painting or acting. Or if you have no skills, you can always help clean up after a class. If you have no skills and no time, you can still write a check to ease the work that others are doing. And if for some bizarre reason you can't find a gay kid who needs help, remember that a straight child who has been helped in his life by a gay person will probably grow into a straight, non-homophobic adult. We can always use more of those. As for those moments when you might be enjoying a quiet time in your local gay bar and a kid wanders in, before you even consider this youth as an object, stop and consider him as your child. What would you want for your own child? There must be a better place for a 17-year-old to make friends than in a bar. Step forward. Be proactive. Be a responsible part of our community so that we can take pride in how we raise our own. Just speaking these words, I can already hear the screams of disbelief that will be filling the In the Life email boxes. But I still insist that you at least consider what I'm saying. Only we can raise proud and independent gay youth. think about getting involved. And as long as we are considering taking responsibility for our children, let us not forget our elderly, because cookies, we may never again be a piece of chicken wandering into our first gay bar, but we will all most likely outlive our welcome in the bar culture. And then, where will we be? No one wants to be out in the cold when they're old and gay. Reach out.
I'm Cherry Jones. And for all of us at In the Life here at OW Bar in New York, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next month. Love is
In the Life is funded in part by the H. Van Ameringen Foundation. Additional support provided by the Ford Foundation, the Pride Foundation, the Gill Foundation, the Ted Snowden Foundation, the Collingwood Foundation, the Otto Haas Charitable Trust No. 2, the Reed Williams Foundation, Alan L. Middlesdorf, Jim Stepp and Peter Zimmer, and the annual support of In the Life members like you.